All right, so as Joe Biden and the Democratic establishment is telling the American people that we simply can't afford all of these massively popular policies that literally everyone in the entire country wants, they're simultaneously gearing up to pass an absolutely massive tax cut for millionaires. Okay, so this story is absolutely ridiculous, and it involves the SALT tax deduction, which if you haven't heard about that, I'm going to give you a little introduction here in terms of what this SALT tax repeal that Democrats are weighing right now might actually mean, because it is like laughably pathetic and ridiculously corrupt how much they are putting effort into getting the SALT tax repealed versus all of the other policies that they just let a handful of corrupt senators cut out of the bill. So here is the state and local tax deduction, basically a very rudimentary rundown of what it is. So what is the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as the SALT deduction? So the state and local tax SALT deduction permits taxpayers who itemize when filing federal taxes to deduct certain taxes paid to state and local governments. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was that massive tax cut for the wealthy that was passed under the Trump administration, capped it at $10,000 per year, consisting of property taxes plus state income or sales taxes, but not both. So if that didn't really make sense to you, basically in a very an easy way to understand, basically the SALT tax basically lets very wealthy people, overwhelmingly wealthy people, as we are about to get into, deduct a certain amount of, in this case, $10,000 from their taxes. If they pay those taxes to state and local governments, then they don't have to redundantly basically pay those also to federal taxes. So that's basically what the SALT tax does. Now, I'm going to show you with statistics that it overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy and pretty much only benefits the wealthy if they repeal this. But here's what Democrats are proposing that they do. So again, there was a $10,000 cap that was put in place under Trump's tax cuts in 2017. And here's what Democrats are trying to do. So the state and local tax, the SALT deduction, was capped at $10,000 under the Trump-era GOP legislation as a means of funding tax cuts that mostly benefited the wealthy and corporations. And according to reports, the Democratic lawmakers are exploring a repeal of the $10,000 limit, not a repeal or an extension or an increase on the cap that they can do, but a total repeal of that $10,000 limit as part of their pared-down budget reconciliation package, a move favored by many Republicans as well as right-wing Democrats from high-tax states. And so just to give you a perspective in terms of who would get to benefit from this, so Harvard economics professor James Furman estimates that, quote, a majority of Americans with a net worth of $50 to $300 million would get a tax cut under the Build Back Better plan with a full repeal of the SALT tax as they are currently planning to do. Let me say that again. Those Americans with a $50 to $300 million net worth would get a tax cut. So Joe Biden ran his entire Build Back Better agenda was let's tax the rich significantly to pay for massive social spending plans. Now, basically all of the most popular social spending plan, or portions of the social spending plan, have been completely gutted out of the bill. And now, not only are they not significantly increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, but now they're giving them a tax cut. Okay, that is where the Democratic Party is at right now, and they wonder why the American people are not rallying behind them. And I'm going to do a couple videos later today about the elections that Democrats absolutely got obliterated in yesterday. But just to give you a perspective in terms of who this actually benefits. So it's very clear who this benefits. It's the top 10%, and even a majority of the benefits are going to the top 1%. So you see here who benefits from the SALT cap repeal here from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. So the top 1% takes 55% nearly of the benefits from repealing the SALT tax. The top 1% takes over half, an outright majority of the benefits, while the next 9% basically take 35%. So in other words, the top 10% get 90% of the benefits from repealing the SALT tax. So in other words, Democrats are willing to pass this piece of legislation with a massive tax cut to the top 10% and even overwhelmingly the top 1%. Okay, so it's just completely ridiculous. And on top of that ridiculousness in and of itself, because Americans overwhelmingly, according to some polls, up to 70-80% of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, want to see taxes on the wealthy go up, okay? But even in that ridiculous nature in and of itself, it's also the cost of this that makes it that much more stupid and absurd that they're doing this. So the SALT cap repeal, which they are weighing right now, would be the costliest part of the Build Back Better plan. So not only is this just a handout to the wealthy, but as they are telling the American people that we can't afford free community college, we can't afford to negotiate lower prescription drug prices, even though that would save us money. We can't afford to have paid family leave. We can't afford to have all of these overwhelmingly popular pieces of policies because we just simply don't have the money for them. Meanwhile, this is the most expensive part of the bill if they end up including it. The single most expensive part of the bill. And just to give you a perspective in terms of how expensive this is, okay? So this is a 5-year SALT cap repeal. So that's only over 5 years. The bill, remember, is over 10 years. So over 5 years, it would be $475 billion. So over 10 years, the equivalent of what this bill is for most of these programs, it would be like $900 billion basically, which is like almost 10 times what it would have cost to actually pass free community college, which is roughly $10 billion per year, or over the same 5-year period would be like close to the same amount. So it's like, it is a tiny fraction of the amount that they are saying we can't afford to do free community college, we can't afford to do paid family leave, but apparently we can afford to give a nearly $500 billion handout to the top 10% and overwhelmingly the top 1%. Okay, this is the most pathetic thing that I have seen Democrats do under the Joe Biden administration so far. But just to make it even worse, okay, here from Max Berger. So the tax cut Democrats are considering for wealthy homeowners starts immediately and is retroactive, but they came up with this stupid little compromise on Medicare negotiating drug prices. But negotiating lower prescription drugs won't start until 2025 and will only include 11 drugs. And even that, they're protecting the patent rights of a lot of these companies so that even some of these drugs, it will never get to the point where we are actually able to successfully negotiate the prices on them. So that doesn't start until 2025, but the tax cuts for the uber wealthy is retroactive, okay? That's what Democrats' priority actually is in getting this Build Back Better, so-called Build Back Better plan passed. But again, until 2025, in other words, 1 year into the Trump administration, that is an inevitable result that we are probably going to be seeing in 2024, allowing Trump to then take credit for the lowering of prescription drug prices, even though it's going to be absolutely minimal, the actual amount that they end up lowering prescription drugs. And so we had some pushback here from Bernie Sanders. Now I'm going to read this, but don't get your hopes up because they basically completely gave up their leverage, as I talked about in yesterday's video. But he says, according to media reports, Democratic negotiators are working on a repeal of the SALT deduction cap for up to 5 years, which would cost $475 billion and give the richest 5% $400 billion in tax cuts. And as a result, the top 1% would pay lower taxes after the passage of Build Back Better plan than they did after the Trump tax cut in 2017. So Democrats not only not undoing the 2017 Trump tax cuts, but extending them and giving the wealthy more tax cuts than the 2017 Trump tax cuts. And at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, the last thing we should be doing is giving more tax breaks to the rich. And Democrats campaigned and won on an agenda that demands that the very wealthy finally pay their fair share, not one that gives them more tax breaks. And he says, I am open to a compromise approach which protects the middle class and high tax states, but I will not support more tax breaks for billionaires. Now, he's 100% right in identifying the problems with this SALT tax repeal, but unfortunately, because House progressives, as again I covered in my video yesterday, as they just completely gave up all of their leverage by agreeing to pass both of these bills out from the House and to the Senate, Bernie has absolutely no leverage here because he can sit here and say, I won't support this bill if it includes the SALT tax reduction. And guess what? Because progressives just gave up their leverage in the House, then Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and the rest of these corporate Democrats can simply turn around to Bernie Sanders and say, okay, well then the entire bill does not get passed. So Bernie, you want to say that you're not going to vote this without the SALT tax repeal? Then nothing gets passed, okay? Absolutely nothing gets passed. And there's no guarantee, even if the SALT cap repeal is in this bill, that anything gets passed anyways. So it's really just an entirely pathetic agenda. And Democrats are going to be going into 2022. At this point, like, it's laughably absurd and pathetic where the Democratic Party is. I really don't have that much to even say about it because it's comical how pathetic this agenda is, okay? Tax cuts for the rich, included in the Build Back Better plan. All of the most popular portions of the bill have been completely gutted, and progressives just gave up all of their leverage in actually ensuring that a good bill gets passed. So it's really a ridiculous situation, and Democrats are just setting themselves up to get absolutely obliterated and clobbered in the 2022 midterms, and it will be nobody's fault but corporate Democrats and the Democratic establishment and Joe Biden himself.